The scream came out of nowhere, a thin, cracked voice tangled in the wet grass below the trail, barely louder than the wind. Caleb Morse dropped his coffee, and the dog was already running. Down the slope, through the brambles. And then he saw her. An old woman, white hair matted with mud, one leg bent the wrong way, staring up at him with the eyes of someone who had stopped believing anyone would come. Before we go on, tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from, and hit subscribe so you don't miss stories like this. 15 minutes earlier, Caleb had been sitting on the same bench he sat on every morning at Cedar Creek Trail, cradling a styrofoam cup of gas station coffee, watching the mist come off the water like it always did. 45 minutes. That was the rule he had made for himself when he came back. 45 minutes of quiet before the day started, before the small apartment and the small job and the small silence that filled the space between him and every other human being on Earth. He had been home 14 months. It still didn't feel like anything. The German shepherd came out of the trees without a sound. That was the first strange thing. Caleb had been trained to notice sound, the crunch of a boot, the shift of gravel, the tick of a rifle sling, and this dog moved through the wet leaves like it was made of them. It walked straight to his knee, like it had been looking for him specifically, and pressed its cold nose against his jeans. Then it lifted one heavy paw and set it on his thigh, gentle as a hand. He looked down, brown eyes, steady, old somehow in a way a dog's eyes shouldn't be. He scratched behind its ear because that was what you did. And for a second, the dog leaned into him, warm and solid. Then it pulled away, trotted 5 or 6 yards up the narrow side trail that ran along the creek and stopped, and looked back over its shoulder, waiting. He went back to his coffee. He was not going to follow a dog into the woods at 7 in the morning like a man in a fairy tale. He had a routine. He had a bench. He was going to sit on it. The dog came back. Same paw, same stare, same slow trot up the side trail, same look over the shoulder. And that was when Caleb heard it, the sound so faint he almost missed it under the water and the wind. A voice, not a shout. A worn-out call, thin as paper, coming from somewhere down the slope. He was on his feet before he'd decided to stand. He followed the dog at a jog, and the dog kept 10 steps ahead, moving like it knew every root and rock. The side trail bent through a stand of oaks and started dropping toward the creek bed. That was when the scream came, and Caleb went down through the brambles with his forearms up, and there she was. The old woman was half buried in the tall grass at the bottom of a shallow gully, jacket soaked through, one ankle folded under her at an angle that made his teeth hurt to look at. A scrape ran from her hairline down to her cheekbone. Her lips were the color of old paper. Her eyes were fever-bright and very, very tired. He crouched slow, hands out where she could see them. "My name is Caleb," he said. "I'm going to help you." "Ranger went to find someone," she whispered, and then, as if she had used the last of the day's words on that sentence, she started to cry without making any sound at all. He didn't tell her not to cry. He'd learned a long time ago that telling somebody not to cry was a coward's kindness. Instead, he did what his hands remembered. He unzipped her jacket a hand's width to check her breathing. He ran 2 fingers around her ankle bone, felt the swelling, felt the give, bad sprain, maybe a hairline, but the bones weren't out of place. He tilted her chin up under his palm and looked at her pupils. Even. He asked her to squeeze his fingers. She could. He asked her name. "Margaret," she said. "Margaret Finley." "How long, Margaret?" "Since the light was blue." He glanced up. It was near 7:30 now, and the light had gone pale and thin. Blue meant maybe an hour and a half, maybe 2. He pulled his phone from his pocket. 1 bar. He turned so his body blocked the wind from her face and made the call the way he had been trained to make it. Flat, clean, no extra words. Cedar Creek Trail, the north side trail off the main loop. 1 patient, Female, mid-70s, conscious, ankle injury, head strike, cold. 12 minutes, the dispatcher said. He said he'd wait. He shrugged off his jacket and laid it over her chest and shoulders. He didn't wear a jacket he couldn't spare, and this one was warm. He tucked it under her chin. She smelled like earth and rain and something older, like a house he hadn't been inside in years. "Ranger," she said, and her hand moved a little in the grass. The dog was already there. It had come down through the brambles without waiting to be told, and it lay across her lap and her thighs like it had done it 1,000 times before, its weight settling over her the way a heavy quilt might. She put her hand into the fur behind its ears without looking, and Caleb watched her whole face change, not less pain, but less alone. The dog closed its eyes. "He's a good boy," Margaret said. Her voice was steadier already, just from the warmth. "He was my son's." Caleb did not answer for a moment. There was a rope somewhere in his chest that he had spent 14 months holding onto, and he felt it slip half an inch. "Which branch?" he asked. "Army," she said, "same as you." He hadn't told her he was Army. He hadn't told her he had been anything. "How could you tell?" "You knelt down and looked at my eyes before you looked at my leg," she said. "That's how the medics did it when they came for him." She said it easy, the way you said things that had already broken you a long time ago and had settled into place. She looked past his shoulder at the pale sky between the oaks, and her hand moved in Ranger's fur. "He didn't come back," she said. "So the dog came back to me." Caleb looked at Ranger, and Ranger looked at Caleb. The dog's eyes were steady and warm and old, and something in Caleb, some door he had welded shut with both hands, cracked half an inch and let a little bit of light in. The ambulance took 13 minutes and change to reach the trailhead, and another 6 for the 2 paramedics to get down the side trail with the folding stretcher. Caleb walked out of the gully with them, one hand on Margaret's shoulder to steady her, Ranger padding along beside the stretcher like it was his job. At the trailhead, a parks officer took Caleb's statement, name, address, phone number, what he'd seen, what he'd done. He handed his jacket to Margaret before they closed the doors, and she wouldn't let go of it. She had it bunched in her fists like it belonged to her. "You come see me," she said. Not a question. "You come see me, Caleb Morse." "Yes, ma'am." The doors closed. The ambulance pulled away. Ranger sat down on Caleb's boot and did not move. The parks officer scratched his chin. "You want me to call animal control?" Caleb looked down at the dog. Ranger looked up. "No, sir," Caleb said. "He's with me." He walked back to the bench with the shepherd walking at his knee. He sat down. He didn't pull his shoulders up around his ears the way he usually did. He drank what was left of a cup of coffee that had gone stone cold in the grass, and the dog leaned against his shin, and for the first time in 14 months, Caleb Morse noticed the way the light came through the leaves. He drove Ranger to a vet on Route 9 because that was the closest place he could think of that would scan a chip and not ask too many questions. The vet was a wiry woman named Priya who took one look at Ranger and said, "That's a working dog. Somebody trained him." The chip scan came back to a name Caleb already half expected. Sergeant First Class Daniel Finley, a registration address in a town called Millbrook 2 counties over, and a note in the file, in small text at the bottom, next of kin, Margaret J. Finley. Priya read the note without meeting Caleb's eyes. She had been a vet in a small town for a long time. She knew what next of kin looked like on a working dog's record. "He's a good weight," she said. "Somebody's feeding him. Somebody's been feeding him for a while. He looks like he can take care of himself." "He can. That's the problem." Priya bent down and put her forehead against Ranger's, and the dog let her. "Dogs like this don't do well alone. They need a person. He's found himself one." Caleb rubbed the back of his neck. "I don't know if I'm the right person for this." "He picked you," Priya said. "Dogs like this don't pick wrong." He paid for the visit in cash and drove the dog back to his apartment. It was a fourth-floor walk-up with 2 rooms and a window that looked out over a strip of parking lot, and it had held 1 man and 1 bed and 1 coffee pot for 14 months. Ranger walked in like he had lived there his whole life. He lay down in front of the door in a spot that gave him the whole room in one look, and put his head on his paws and watched Caleb like a job. Caleb stood in his kitchen and looked at the dog. The dog looked back. "All right," he said. It was the first word he'd spoken in his own apartment in 3 days. He drove to Millbrook Memorial the next morning with Ranger in the passenger seat. The dog did not fuss with the seat belt. He rode like he had ridden in a lot of trucks and cars in his life. Caleb had bought a leash on the way and a small bag of good kibble and a bowl for water, and he had felt like a fool doing it, and he had done it anyway. Margaret was in a room on the 3rd floor. She had a soft cast on her ankle, a butterfly bandage over the scrape on her forehead, and an IV in the back of her hand. She was sitting up. She was reading a paperback with a broken spine. When she saw him in the doorway, her whole face lit up, and then she saw the dog and the paperback fell into her lap. "Oh," she said. Ranger crossed the room and put his chin on the edge of her bed. Margaret cried the same way she had cried in the gully, silent, no shoulders, just water. She put her forehead against Ranger's forehead and left it there. "They wouldn't let him come in the ambulance," she said. "I told them, and they wouldn't. He's here now. He's here now." A nurse came in and gave Caleb a look. You couldn't have a dog in a hospital room. Everybody knew that. But she looked at Margaret's face, and she looked at Ranger's manners, and she walked out again without a word. Caleb owed her one. He sat down in the chair by the window. He was not a man who visited people in hospitals. He was not a man who visited people. He didn't know where to put his hands. Margaret didn't seem to notice. She talked to him the way you talk to somebody you had known for years. She told him about the paperback and how she couldn't focus on it, and the pudding they had brought her and how she was going to sneak it to Ranger the second the nurse turned around, and about the son who had given her Ranger. His name was Daniel. He had been 31 years old. He had come home from his first tour and started staying up all night in the kitchen of Margaret's little farmhouse, staring at the linoleum, and after 4 months of that, he had told her he had to go back, that he could not sit still in his own skin, that at least over there he was useful. Ranger had come home the year Daniel deployed the second time, an 8-month-old puppy that Daniel had picked out from a breeder outside of Fort Bragg. "In case anything happens," Daniel had said, "take care of him for me." Something had happened, not in combat, not the way she'd been afraid of. Daniel had come back from his second tour whole in body and half in mind, and one afternoon on a 2-lane road in the pine country, he had let the truck drift over the yellow line and not corrected. It had been a long time before Margaret let herself believe he had not corrected because he was tired. But she was 76 years old now, and she had had a lot of quiet hours, and she believed what she believed. Caleb sat with that for a long time. Outside the window, a hospital sparrow was worrying a piece of plastic against the concrete. "He'd be your age," she said. "Give or take." "I'm 32. Give or take." He watched Ranger's ribs go up and down against the edge of the bed. He thought about the road he had driven home on from Fort Hood, the empty seat next to him, the way he had not turned the radio on for 1,000 miles. He thought about the reason he had built the bench routine, because he could not stay in his apartment in the mornings without lying very still and counting the ceiling tiles, and he had needed a reason to leave the building before the counting started. He thought about how a dog he had never met had trotted straight to his knee. "I'll take care of him," he said, "while you're in here." That would be a kindness. "When they let you out, I'll bring him to you." She looked at him a long time. "Caleb," she said, and her voice was gentle and dry all at once. "I don't know if they're going to let me out to a place he can come." That was the first pin dropping. He didn't ask her right then. It felt cruel to press a woman with an IV in her hand, but when he stood to leave, he stopped at the door and looked back, and he said, "Who wouldn't?" Margaret let a small, tired smile move across her mouth. "My nephew," she said. "You'll meet him. He'll make it easy." The nephew's name was Grant Whitaker, and he showed up at the hospital the next day at 3 in the afternoon, right on schedule, the way certain kinds of men always did. Caleb had come back to bring Margaret a real cup of coffee and a jelly donut and a section of the newspaper she had asked for, and he was in the visitor chair when Grant walked in. Grant was in his early 40s, soft in the belly, thin at the temples, wearing a dress shirt with the collar unbuttoned to show he was doing you a favor. He had the kind of smile a man practices in the mirror on the way to a meeting. He took one look at Caleb sitting in the visitor chair, one look at Ranger lying across Margaret's feet, and the smile hitched half an inch and settled back into place. "Aunt Margaret," he said, "how are we doing today?" "Better, Grant, thank you. And this is?" "Caleb Morse. He's the one who found me." Grant offered his hand the way certain men offer their hand, palm slightly downward, fingers stiff. Caleb took it and let it be brief. Grant's palm was dry and cool. He did not look Caleb in the eye. He looked at Caleb's boots, then at Caleb's watch, then at Caleb's mouth. He was pricing everything the way you price a used car. "Awful business," Grant said, "just awful. Aunt Margaret, we need to talk about a few things. Maybe your friend here." "He's staying," Margaret said, without moving her hand out of Ranger's fur. Grant's smile stretched a half-millimeter. He sat down on the edge of the bed. He put his hand on Margaret's hand, the one with the IV in it, and Margaret's face went perfectly still. "And Margaret," Grant said softly, the way you'd speak to a child who wasn't quite following, "this is a real wake-up call. That's what this is. You could have died out there, in the woods, alone, with just the dog." He glanced down at Ranger with a small twitch at the corner of his mouth. "The house is too much for you. The stairs, the yard, that stove of yours. You've been meaning to fix that stove for 2 years. Sarah and I have been talking. The condition of the house, the neighborhood, it isn't safe. I've lived in that house for 51 years, Grant, which is why it isn't safe. Aunt Margaret, we're only thinking about you. There's a very nice place in Franklin. We could visit you every Sunday. Sarah's already looked into it. The paperwork." He fished a folded set of pages out of his back pocket, all of it soft from having been carried around all week, and set it on the bedside table. "Is very reasonable. We just need you to sign the intake authorization when they say you're ready to be discharged, and the property." Margaret stared at the folded paperwork for a long time. "The property," she said. Grant did the smile again. "The property we handle. As power of attorney, you don't lift a finger. Everything is taken care of. Every last penny goes into your care." Caleb had been watching Grant's face the entire time. Caleb had, in his life, learned to watch faces. He had watched them across checkpoint tables in dust storms. He had watched them across hospital cots when there was still hope and when there was no longer any. He knew what a face looked like when it was telling the truth and when it was performing a kindness it did not feel. Grant's face was performing. "You mean sell the house," Margaret said, "to fund your care." "To fund what, Grant?" "Aunt Margaret, I'm not signing anything today." Grant's smile went thin at the edges. He stood up. He gathered his papers back off the table with careful fingers, none of the softness he had put on for her, and slid them into his back pocket. He looked at Caleb for the first time. "Mr. Morse," he said, "I appreciate what you did for my aunt, but she's not thinking clearly right now, and she's easily influenced, and I don't want her to become a project for someone who, with respect, doesn't understand our family situation." "I understand Ma'am's not signing anything today," Caleb said. His voice was even and quiet. It was the voice he had used to have on the radio when things were going bad. Grant looked at him for another beat, and then he leaned down and kissed the top of Margaret's head and told her he'd be back tomorrow, and walked out. Ranger did not lift his head, but a low sound came out of the top of his chest that made the hair on the back of Caleb's neck stand up. Margaret let out a long breath. "I told you," she said. "He'll make it easy." Caleb turned the folded newspaper over in his hands. He didn't ask her anything for a while. Outside the window, the sparrow was back. "What's on the property?" he said eventually. "That he wants." "Nothing." A pause. "Everything. The land's been in my family since my grandfather's time. It runs down to the creek. There's an old orchard nobody's touched since my husband died. And there's a builder in Franklin who's been sending letters for 3 years." "What kind of letters?" "Nice ones. That started nice. Then not nice. Do you have them?" "In a shoebox in my kitchen on top of the icebox." "Do you have anyone besides Grant?" She looked at Ranger's ears for a long time. "I had my son," she said. "Now I have Ranger. And I have a friend named Ethel from church who thinks Grant is a snake in a nice shirt. That's the list." Caleb folded the newspaper. He tapped it against his knee. "You need me to check on your house, Miss Finley." "That would be a kindness, Caleb Morse." She gave him a key. The Finley farmhouse sat at the end of a gravel road 3 miles outside of Millbrook, on a strip of land that ran down to the creek Margaret loved so much. It was white clapboard, 1 story, with a wraparound porch that had gone soft in 2 places and a screen door that did not close by itself anymore. The orchard she had mentioned started around the back, 30 or 40 gnarled apple trees that had gone almost feral, their branches so tangled you couldn't see the sky through them. Caleb pulled his truck up to the porch a little after 9 in the morning with Ranger in the passenger seat. Ranger did not wait for the door. The second Caleb popped the handle, the dog was out and across the yard and up the porch steps like he was home, because he was. Ranger stood on the top step, his nose against the front door, and made a sound so small it wasn't even a whine. It was the sound of a dog who had been away too long. Caleb let them both in. The house smelled like coffee grounds and old newspaper and something warm and dry, like a cedar chest. Margaret had left in a hurry, a mug half drained on the kitchen counter, a pair of gardening gloves folded on the table, a coat hook holding an empty spot where her jacket had been the morning she'd walked out into the trail. The kitchen faced the orchard, a big square window over the sink, a calendar on the wall with days X'd out in green pen up until the Tuesday she had fallen. The shoebox was on top of the icebox, exactly where she had said. He set it on the kitchen table and opened it. There were 42 letters inside. He knew because he counted, because that was what his hands did with paper. 28 of them were from a company called Whitaker and Vance Development, on nice cream stationery, over the course of 3 years. The first few were polite, introductory, complimentary, offering well above market for the parcel, which they called an exceptional opportunity for a mixed-use community. The next few grew warmer, more familiar. Then they cooled. Then they got quiet. The last one was 6 months old, and it was a single paragraph, and the word unfortunate appeared twice. Caleb read them all. He read them slowly, and then he read the letterhead again. Whitaker and Vance Development. Whitaker. He set the last letter down on the kitchen table and looked at Ranger, who was sitting in a shaft of morning light in the middle of the kitchen floor, watching him. "Well," Caleb said out loud. "Well, well." The other 14 letters in the box were personal. 3 of them were from Margaret's son. Caleb didn't read them. He put them back in the box carefully. But the top one was creased and recreased in a pattern he recognized. A letter that had been opened and folded and reopened 1,000 times. That was a letter that had done work. He walked the property. He walked it because if you were going to help a woman keep her land, you should know the land. The orchard was old but not dead. A handful of the trees had put out fruit that was rotting on the ground, and there were bees where the ground was sweetest. Behind the orchard was a stretch of soft pasture that sloped down to the creek. The creek was clear and quick and had a sandy bottom. There was an old fence line half swallowed by grass, and beyond it a stand of pine that must have belonged to somebody else. Caleb stood in the pasture for a while and looked back at the house from the far end and tried to see it the way Grant Whitaker saw it. He could see it: frontage, water, trees, access, the mind of a man who saw land and did not see land. He walked back up to the porch. He fixed the screen door with a screwdriver and a piece of shim he found in the toolbox in the mudroom. He mowed a strip along the front so the driveway did not look abandoned. He fed Ranger on the porch out of the bag he had bought at the vet, and Ranger ate slowly, keeping one eye on the yard the whole time, the way an old soldier ate. That night, back at his apartment, Caleb sat at his kitchen table with a legal pad and made a list. At the top of the list he wrote, "What Grant wants." Underneath he wrote, "The land," not the aunt, not the care, the land. Under that, "Whitaker and Vance is Grant." He circled it twice. Then he wrote, "What Margaret wants." And under that, the answer surprised him a little as it came out of his pen. "She wants to go home." He looked at the list for a long time. Then he wrote one more line at the bottom. "She's not going to lose the house. Not on my watch." Ranger, on the floor by his feet, made a small sound in his throat and put his chin on Caleb's boot. The next morning, Caleb went to see Ethel at the church Margaret had told him about. Ethel was 79, wore a purple cardigan on a Wednesday, and stood 5 feet 3 inches tall in her flats. She was drying communion cups in a linen towel in the back kitchen of Grace Chapel Baptist when Caleb walked in, and she took him in from boot to buzz cut with a single sweep of her eyes. "You must be the one who found her," she said. "Yes, ma'am. Sit." He sat. She poured him coffee out of a percolator that looked older than the building. She set a plate of shortbread cookies in front of him that he did not eat. She did not sit down. She kept drying cups. That was how Ethel talked, apparently, while doing something else, as if talking were something you did on the side. "Grant Whitaker was a nasty little boy," she said. "He used to steal the offering plate coins when we sent them around the pews for the mission fund. Everybody knew it was him. His mother, God rest her, wouldn't hear a word said. He grew up and got worse. That's it. That's my whole opinion. Are you a religious man, Mr. Morse?" "No, ma'am. I don't hold it against you. Margaret talked about you when they let her use the phone last night. She said the dog picked you. That means something. Not scripture, dog, but it means something." She set down the towel. "He's going to try to have her declared incompetent, you know. That's the play. He's got a lawyer in Franklin who does it 3 times a year for old ladies with no one to speak for them. There's a hearing scheduled 2 weeks out. He filed the petition 3 days after they took her to the hospital. That fast. That's how ready he was." "How do you know that?" "Because his lawyer's secretary is my great-niece Cassidy, and Cassidy has a big mouth and no love for her boss. 2 weeks, Mr. Morse. 2 weeks." Caleb set his coffee cup down very carefully. "That's not enough time for her to recover well enough to look sharp in a courtroom. That is precisely the point." Ethel picked up the towel again. "You're going to need 3 things," she said. "You're going to need a doctor to say she's of sound mind. You're going to need to poke a hole in his conflict of interest. This business of him being the developer and the guardian at the same time. And you're going to need to get her home. She won't fight for the house from a hospital bed. She'll fight for it from her kitchen. How do I get her home? You make it safe. You put a rail on the porch step. You clear the walk. You make sure she doesn't have to take that back staircase. You do it before the discharge planner comes through, so when Grant tells them the house is unsafe, the discharge planner has already seen it herself. You've done this before." "I have been alive," Ethel said, "for a very long time." She wrapped 4 shortbread cookies in a napkin and pressed them into his hand as he left. "Take these to her," she said, "and tell her Ethel says the snake is moving." He drove back to the Finley farmhouse that same day and spent every daylight hour on it. He fixed the 2 soft boards on the porch. He hammered a length of galvanized pipe into the ground beside the porch step for a temporary handrail, and bolted a longer piece of 2x4 along the porch itself for her to hold. He raked the gravel drive smooth so a walker or a cane wouldn't catch. He climbed a stepladder and knocked down 2 dirt dauber nests off the eaves. He cleaned the stove Grant had been so worried about, and found it was fine. The pilot needed relighting and the burner grates needed a scrub. 10 minutes with a wire brush and a lighter. He did all of it with Ranger following him from room to room, keeping the yard in view through whichever window was closest. That evening Priya the vet came out. He had called her from the porch. He had told her what he needed, and she had said, quiet and quick, "I know a doctor who owes me a favor. She was Army too. She's good with veterans and their people. What's the appointment for?" "Competency exam." Priya was quiet on the line for a beat. "I'll get you her number tonight." The doctor's name was Anne Delacroix, and she was a geriatrician in Franklin who had been a battalion surgeon a lifetime ago. She met Margaret at the hospital the next morning in the room where Margaret was recovering. Caleb stood outside in the hallway with Ranger and drank vending machine coffee and watched the door. Anne Delacroix came out an hour later. She was a small woman with a very direct face. "Your Miss Finley," she said, "is as sharp as a paring knife. I asked her the year, the president, the name of the town, the name of her son, and the exact page and paragraph she was on in her paperback when she went to bed last night. She got every single one. I asked her to name 3 things she'd want to plant if she got home, and she named an heirloom peach, an old climbing rose, and a row of runner beans, and she told me what to plant them near and why. I have my report. It will be in Judge Halloran's hands by 5 o'clock tomorrow. She's fine. She's more than fine. She's got more clarity than my second husband." Caleb almost laughed. "Doctor," he said, "thank you." "You did the finding," Anne said. "I did the paperwork. Different jobs." She walked off down the hospital corridor with her coat swinging behind her. 2 mornings later, they let Margaret out. The discharge planner was a young woman with a clipboard and the tired kindness of someone who worked too many hours, and she came out to the farmhouse the afternoon before to do the safety walk-through. Caleb had told Margaret about it, and Margaret had told Ethel, and Ethel had brought a plate of biscuits and set them on the kitchen table like she owned the place. The discharge planner took one look at the porch rail, the clean stove, the clear drive, the biscuits, and the 79-year-old woman in the purple cardigan pouring her coffee, and she signed the release. Grant Whitaker had not been informed of the visit. That was on purpose. Ethel's great-niece Cassidy had gotten a piece of information late one night that the discharge planner was scheduled to come by that Wednesday. And Ethel had made a phone call, and now here they were, with the release signed and Grant blindsided by 24 hours. Ranger was already at the farmhouse, where Ethel had brought him to wait. Margaret came down in the wheelchair with the little bag of her own clothes in her lap and the paperback with the broken spine on top of it and a look on her face like a woman going home. The orderly wheeled her to the curb. Caleb offered his arm. She took it. She stood up on the good ankle and the soft cast, and she took 2 careful steps and swung herself into the truck. She kissed Caleb on the cheek. Her lips were dry and warm. "Take me home, please, Mr. Morse." He took her home. When she saw Ranger in the yard, she made a sound Caleb had never heard a person make before. Not a cry, not a laugh, but something between them. The dog crossed the driveway in 3 bounds and stopped short of the truck door, self-controlled, the way a working dog is self-controlled around an injured person. Margaret got herself down out of the truck, one careful movement at a time. She sat down on the porch step. Ranger put his chin on her lap. She put her forehead down on his head and stayed there for a long, long minute. "Home," she said. Ethel had made a stew. There was a pie under a dish towel, there was a fresh pot of coffee, and there were fresh flowers on the table cut from Margaret's own front yard. Caleb went to the truck and brought in the shoebox of letters and set it in the pantry where it belonged. He built a fire in the little wood stove, even though it was warm out, because the house had been empty for a week and needed a heart in it. Margaret sat in her chair by the window with Ranger's chin on her knee and looked out at her orchard. And every time Caleb passed through the room, she caught his sleeve and squeezed it once and let it go. He slept in her son's old room that night, on Margaret's insistence. "I don't want to be alone in the house yet," she said, "and Ranger sleeps where you sleep now. He picked you. That's how he is." He slept better than he had slept in 14 months. Ranger slept across the doorway of Daniel's old room like he was on watch. Grant found out about the discharge the next morning, and he showed up at 8:30 with a woman in a grey suit and a manila envelope. Caleb was on the porch with a mug of coffee. Margaret was in the kitchen. Ranger was already halfway down the porch steps by the time Grant's car door had shut, and Grant froze with one hand on the top of his car and the other hand holding the envelope up like a shield. "Call your dog off, please, Mr. Morse." "Ranger," Caleb said, "come." Ranger came. He sat down on Caleb's boot. He did not take his eyes off Grant. Grant walked up to the porch with the woman in tow. She had short blonde hair and a lawyer's smile, tight and professional, and she introduced herself as Eleanor Peck of Peck and Sons. She was, Caleb understood immediately, the woman Ethel had warned him about. The one who did 3 of these a year. "Mr. Morse," Grant said, "we need to see my aunt. This is my legal representative. There are matters to discuss." Margaret came to the door in her cardigan and her house slippers, with her cane in her right hand. Caleb had gotten her a good cane the day before at a medical supply store. She looked like a woman in her own house. She did not look confused, and she did not look tired, and she did not look 60 seconds from signing anything. "Grant," she said, "Aunt Margaret, may we come in?" "You may come in for 10 minutes. Ms. Peck, you're welcome to sit at the kitchen table." Ranger followed them in. He lay down between Margaret's chair and the door. Caleb sat down at Margaret's right hand and did not speak. Ms. Peck opened the manila envelope. She said the words Caleb had been expecting, words like emergency petition and temporary conservatorship, and the hearing has been moved up to Thursday of next week. She said that in light of recent physical injury and the potential for cognitive decline, Grant Whitaker was seeking temporary authority to manage Margaret's financial affairs pending a full evaluation. She was very polite. She was very smooth. "That is Dr. Delacroix's report you're holding in your envelope, isn't it, Ms. Peck?" Margaret said, without moving her head. Ms. Peck's smile hitched a millimeter. "There is a report from a Dr. Delacroix, yes. And you've read it." "I have. And I'm perfectly sharp, according to her." The report is generally favorable." "Yes." "Then why are we still having this meeting, Ms. Peck?" Ms. Peck looked at Grant. Grant looked at his aunt. "Aunt Margaret, the physical injury is only the beginning of the concern. The house, the isolation, the animal." He looked at Ranger and the corner of his mouth twitched again. "That's a working military dog with a bite history. You should not be alone in a house with an animal like that. Ranger has no bite history. He has protective instincts. So do I." Grant let out a small, exasperated laugh. "Aunt Margaret, please, I'm trying to help you. This animal is dangerous. He was flagged by the training program at Bragg. Daniel never told you, but the dog was released because he showed excessive protective response toward his handler. He is a liability, and if he bites someone on this property, the county will take it, and you will be, in a legal position you do not want to be in." Margaret went very still. Caleb watched her hands. Her hands did not shake. "Grant," she said softly, "how do you know what was in Daniel's training file?" Grant blinked. "He must have told me." "He never told anybody anything, Grant." Not you, not me, not the Lord above. So how do you know what was in his file? Ms. Peck cleared her throat. That's not the material issue for today. It is the material issue for today, Margaret said. The material issue for today is that my nephew has been going through my son's papers, and he has been going through them for some time, and he has found something in them he thinks he can use. Well, let him try. She turned to Caleb. Caleb, she said, would you please walk Ms. Peck and my nephew back to their car? He walked them off the property. Grant said things on the way to the car. Caleb did not answer any of them. He shut the car door for Grant with his own hand, gently, the way you closed something you were finished with. He watched them drive down the gravel road until they turned onto the county highway and disappeared. When he came back inside, Margaret was still sitting at the kitchen table. Her hand was on Ranger's head. She was looking at the shoebox in her lap. He's been in this box, she said. I know. When? It could have been any time in the last 3 years, but recently, I think. He knew things he shouldn't have known. He'd have needed something in writing. There isn't a letter about the dog in this box. Then he found something somewhere else. Margaret was quiet a long time. Daniel had a small safe, she said at last, in the back of his closet. I couldn't ever bring myself to open it after. I have the combination somewhere. He gave it to me before he shipped out the second time. I put it in a drawer. Some drawer. You want me to help you look? Please. They spent the next 2 hours going through drawers, and Ranger lay in the sun on the kitchen floor and watched them, and Margaret gave up 3 different times and then went back to it. And finally, in the bottom of a jewelry box in the top drawer of her dressing table, wrapped in a piece of tissue paper, was a slip of paper with a 5-number combination in her son's small, careful handwriting. The safe was where she said it would be, in the back of the closet in her son's room, buried under a pile of blankets. It was a small, dark green safe, no bigger than a bread box, with a dial on the front. Caleb carried it out into the kitchen and set it on the table and turned the dial by the combination. Right 47, left 22, right 9, left 31, right 16. The safe opened. Inside were 3 things. A small canvas pouch full of coins, mostly foreign, that Daniel had brought back from his deployments, a silver dog tag chain with 2 dog tags on it, and a St. Christopher medal that had been worn until the face of the saint was almost smooth, and a manila folder sealed with a piece of masking tape on which Daniel had written in the same small, careful hand, "For Mama, when the time comes." Margaret's fingers hovered over the folder for a long time. I don't know if I can, she said. Then I'll open it and you tell me if you want me to close it back up. She nodded once. Caleb peeled the tape carefully. He opened the folder. On top was a letter, handwritten on lined paper, dated 3 months before Daniel had died. Caleb read the first line and stopped. Do you want me to read it aloud? Yes, he read. Mama, if you're reading this, it means the time came. And I'm going to try to trust you'll know what to do with what's in this folder. I hope you never have to open it. But I'm your son, and I've been thinking about the farm and about Grant. And I know what he's like, and I know what he wants. I've never told you because you love your sister's boy the way you love a nephew, and I'd never take that from you. But I want you to have the farm, Mama, not because it's worth money. Because it's the place you can still hear Dad in the kitchen if you sit still. I don't want it sold. I don't want it broken up. I want it to be there for you to walk out onto the porch every morning of your life. So I did something. There is a trust. It's called the Finley Family Land Trust. I set it up before I shipped out the second time, with a lawyer named Ben Cardoza in Franklin. The land is in the trust. You have a life estate. You cannot lose it, Mama. Grant cannot make you lose it. The trust says that during your lifetime the property may not be sold or encumbered without your written consent. And after you're gone, it goes to a veterans agricultural training program I picked out. Not to Grant, not to Sarah. Not to anyone in Grant's family. I hope you'll understand. The trust paperwork is in a safe deposit box at First National in Franklin. Box number 241. There are 2 keys. One is in this envelope. The other one is with Ben Cardoza. The account is set up so that Ben is co-trustee with you, and you can choose to add another co-trustee if you want to. Ben knows. He's been waiting for you. Grant is going to try to convince you the house is too much. Grant is going to try to convince you to sign things. Don't sign anything, Mama. Don't sign one single piece of paper he brings you, not one. Call Ben. Mama, I'm sorry. I know this letter is a hard one. But you gave me my life and I want to give you your home, and this is the only way I know how to do it from where I'm going. I love you. Danny. Caleb set the letter down on the kitchen table. He didn't look up for a while. He put his hand flat on the table and let it rest there. Ranger stood up from the floor and came over and pressed his big, warm head against Margaret's knee, and Margaret laid the palm of her hand on top of Ranger's skull and did not move for a long, long time. I forgot, she said finally. Her voice was so small it was almost gone. Caleb, I forgot he did that. He told me. I remember now. He told me about a lawyer, and I was crying, and I didn't hear him. I didn't want to think about anything happening to him, and I put it away. Caleb, I forgot my own son's last gift to me. You didn't forget him, Caleb said. You just couldn't carry it yet. And now you can. She wept then. Not silent this time, the whole way through. Caleb sat with her, and Ranger sat with her, and after a while she took a long breath and wiped her face on the sleeve of her cardigan and looked at the letter again. Ben Cardoza. Ben Cardoza. There was a small brass key taped to the back of the folder. Caleb peeled it off and set it on the table. Margaret picked it up in fingers that had gotten steady again. Then let's go find Ben Cardoza, she said. Ben Cardoza had an office above a hardware store in Franklin, up a flight of stairs so narrow that Caleb had to turn sideways at the landing. He was in his mid-50s, tall and stooped, with the long, careful hands of a man who had done paperwork his whole life. He had been Daniel's lawyer. He had also, it turned out, served 2 tours in the Marines in the 80s, which he did not mention until Caleb noticed the photograph on the wall behind his desk, and Ben caught his eye. He nodded once, small, and did not say anything else about it. They understood each other from that moment on. Margaret came up the stairs with her cane in one hand and Caleb's elbow under the other, and she sat in the leather chair across from Ben Cardoza's desk, and she set Daniel's letter on his blotter. Ben Cardoza looked at the letter. He looked at Margaret. He took his glasses off and rubbed the bridge of his nose, and then he put them back on. Mrs. Finley, he said, I have been waiting a long time for you to walk in that door. He opened a locked drawer of his desk. He pulled out a manila folder that was thick enough to be a book. He set it on the desk between them. Your son was a very meticulous young man, he said, meticulous and worried, and I would say with respect, right to be worried. He told me about Grant. He told me about the development letters. He told me how much he loved you and how much he had already lost and how much he was afraid to lose more. And he set up a trust that is, Ben paused, weighing the word, essentially bulletproof. It has been sitting in that drawer and in a safe deposit box down the street, waiting for you. Can Grant break it? Caleb said. No, not in any real sense. He can attempt to challenge it. He will lose. The trust was properly funded, properly registered, and it predates any competency question by more than 3 years. There is no theory under which a court in this state, any court in this state, would set it aside. Furthermore, Ben tapped the folder once. Grant has been sending your aunt letters on stationery from a development company he half owns, offering to purchase land she does not have the authority to sell. If he had known about the trust, he would have known those letters were legally meaningless. He did not know, which tells me he was hoping to get her to sign something before he ever had to find out. Now, he will find out. So the hearing next Thursday will be very short. I will be there. I would like Margaret to be there if she is willing. Not to speak, she doesn't have to speak, simply to be present. I will bring the trust documents, Dr. Delacroix's report, and a copy of the state statute on developer conflict of interest. Judge Halloran will read those documents. And then Grant will not be Margaret's guardian, and he will not be developing anything, and he will, if we ask, be under an order that prevents him from further contact with Margaret without her consent. Margaret was very quiet. I don't want him prosecuted, she said. That is not what we would seek. He was a very sweet little boy for about 3 years of his life. His mother, my sister, died when he was young. He wasn't the same after that. Margaret, Ben Cardoza said gently, you are the most decent human being I have ever had the pleasure of representing. And your decency is not going to change what needs to be done. You are going to keep your house. You are going to keep your peace. And Grant Whitaker is not going to be a part of your day-to-day life anymore. Is that acceptable? She looked at Caleb. Caleb looked back. He did not say anything. This was hers to answer. Yes, she said. That is acceptable. They came out of Ben Cardoza's office and stood on the sidewalk in front of the hardware store, blinking in the afternoon sun. Margaret held Caleb's arm. She was smaller than she had been that morning, and taller at the same time. I want to sit down somewhere for a piece of pie, she said. I want to sit down somewhere I don't know the waitress, and I want to have a piece of pie, and I want to not talk about anything for 20 minutes. He drove them to a diner on the far side of Franklin that he had never been to. She had a slice of apricot pie and a cup of black coffee. He had a slice of banana cream and a glass of ice water. They ate in silence, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who had done a hard thing together and were both letting their hands come back down. When they got back to the truck, Margaret looked at him across the roof. Caleb Morse, she said, I have not been this happy in 3 years. I want you to know that. He didn't know what to say. He nodded. He opened the door for her. He handed her up into the seat. She patted his cheek once, dry and warm. I need to nap when I get home, she said. Yes, Mum. That was the moment before the roof caved in. He remembered it later exactly like that. The truck door, her hand on his cheek. The dry, warm afternoon. That was the last minute before everything went sideways. They got back to the farmhouse at almost 4 in the afternoon. Ethel's car was in the driveway, which was expected. She had come to sit with Ranger for the day so the dog would not be alone. But the sheriff's cruiser next to Ethel's car was not expected. Ethel was standing on the porch with her arms crossed and a look on her face that Caleb had seen on his own mother's face once, long ago, when a neighbor's son had said the wrong thing about his sister. The sheriff's deputy was a young man, maybe 28, with a clipboard and a nervous jaw. He turned when the truck door slammed, and he pulled the clipboard up as if it were a shield. Ms. Finley, he said, I'm sorry. We received a complaint this afternoon, a bite complaint. A neighbor from the Corley property called it in. Says your dog got out onto the county road this morning and bit her 7-year-old grandson on the wrist. Says the boy needed stitches. We have to take the dog into custody pending investigation. Margaret stopped in the middle of the yard. Caleb felt his whole body go very still, the way it went still when a checkpoint gate opened at night and the wrong car was on the other side of it. That did not happen, Margaret said. Ma'am, I was here all morning, Ethel said from the porch. I was here from 6 this morning. That dog did not leave the yard. That dog was under my feet in the kitchen. That dog has never been on the county road, and the Corley grandchild was not at the Corley farm today because Margie Corley told me at church on Sunday that they were driving him to Charlotte for the week for basketball camp. The deputy's jaw moved. Ma'am, I still have to file the complaint and I still have to take the animal into custody. That's the procedure when there's an alleged bite. I'm sorry. Ranger was on the porch behind Ethel. He had come out when the truck pulled up, and he was standing very still, and he was looking at Caleb with the same steady eyes he'd looked at him with the first morning on the bench. He was not barking. He was not growling. He was just waiting. Caleb walked up onto the porch. He knelt down in front of the dog. "Ranger," he said. "Ranger, hey!" The dog put his head against Caleb's chest. The deputy came up the porch steps with a soft loop-collar leash. He knelt down and slipped it over Ranger's head gently, and Ranger did not fight him. Ranger walked to the cruiser like he had walked to Margaret's stretcher the first morning, like it was his job. The deputy paused at the door with the dog's head under his hand. "Ma'am," he said, "I'll be honest. I don't like this call. I've been on this beat 6 years. That dog is not a biter, but procedure is procedure. There's a 10-day hold. If nothing is proved by day 10, he comes back. I promise you that." "10 days," Margaret whispered. "Yes, ma'am." The cruiser drove away with Ranger sitting on the back seat, calm as a Sunday morning, watching Margaret through the back window until the gravel road turned and he was gone. Margaret sat down on the porch step and put both hands over her face. She did not cry. She did not make a sound. She just sat there, folded over, and Ethel came and sat beside her and put both arms around her without saying anything. Caleb stood at the edge of the porch and looked down the gravel road at the dust settling. 10 days. The hearing was in 8. He walked out into the middle of the yard, and he stood there, and he thought, very clearly, for the first time in 14 months, "I'm not going to lose this. Not this one. Not this." He called the shelter from the porch. The shelter said the dog would be held at the County Animal Control Facility on Route 6 in a cinder-block building at the back of the county fairgrounds. He would be held in a run of his own. He would be fed twice a day. He would not be euthanized during the hold period unless he demonstrated aggressive behavior towards staff, which, the woman on the phone said softly, she had not seen from this particular animal in the 2 hours he had been in her care. "He's laying down against the front of the kennel with his nose against the bars," she said. "He's not moving. He's not going to move, I don't think, until you come. Is he yours?" "He's Margaret Finley's. You come with her tomorrow, during visiting hours, 10 to 2. She can sit with him through the bars." He hung up. He looked at Margaret, still on the porch step in Ethel's arms. "He's all right," he said. "For tonight, he's all right." He drove to the Corley farm. The Corley farm was a mile up the county road from Margaret's. Margie Corley opened the door in a bathrobe over her house dress, and Caleb explained who he was, and Margie put her hand to her mouth. "Somebody called in what?" "Somebody called in that your grandson was bitten by Margaret's dog this morning on the road. My grandson is in Charlotte at basketball camp until Sunday. Caleb, I dropped him off myself. I have the receipt from the gas station. Would you write that down for me? Would you sign it and date it? I'd notarize it if you gave me 20 minutes. She did. She drove into town in her bathrobe over her house dress, and she got her cousin the notary out of a card game on a Wednesday night, and she came back with a notarized signed statement that her grandson was not on the property, was not in the state, and had never been bitten by Margaret Finley's dog. She handed Caleb the paper on her front porch. "You catch whoever did this," she said. "You catch them, and you stand on their neck." He drove back to the farmhouse, and he did not go to bed that night. He sat at Margaret's kitchen table, and he wrote a timeline. 6 in the morning, Ranger in the kitchen. 7 in the morning, Ethel arrived. 7:30 in the morning, Caleb and Margaret drove into Franklin. 9 in the morning, Ranger nap in the sun on the porch. 10 in the morning, Ranger walk in the yard with Ethel. 11 in the morning through 3 in the afternoon, Ranger under the kitchen table with Ethel. Ethel wrote her own statement in her own handwriting and signed it at the bottom. At 4 in the morning, Caleb finally called Ben Cardoza's home phone. Ben picked up on the second ring. "I heard about the dog," Ben said before Caleb could speak. "Cassidy called Ethel, and Ethel called me. Grant's lawyer's office had a strange call this afternoon from a woman I don't know, and Cassidy overheard the tail end of it. She thinks the woman was hired to phone in the complaint. She doesn't have a name. She's working on it. He tried to hurt the dog to break Margaret, Caleb said. That is what he tried to do. Yes, Ben said. That is what he tried to do. There was a long silence on the phone. Ben Cardoza was breathing carefully at the other end. I want to move the hearing up, Ben said. I want it on Monday. I want to file for injunctive relief on the dog on Friday. I want a judge to sign an order that dog is coming home before he becomes an issue. Can we do that? We can try. I know Judge Halloran. I served with his brother. It's not enough to guarantee anything, but it's enough to get a call returned. I'll file first thing in the morning. What do you need from me? Everything you've got. Ethel's statement, Corley's statement, the vet Priya, anybody who has seen that dog in the last month who can testify to his temperament. And I want to know who made that call. I'll get you every name I can find. Caleb, Ben said, get some sleep first. No, sir. Ben Cardoza laughed once, tired and low. I didn't figure. Good night, Sergeant. Caleb blinked. Nobody had called him that in 14 months. Good night, sir. He hung up. He put his elbows on the kitchen table, and he put his forehead in his hands, and he sat there for a while, and the house was very quiet, and Ranger was not on the floor, and it felt bigger and colder than it should have felt. He got up. He went out onto the porch. He looked at the orchard in the pale light. He said out loud to nobody and to Daniel Finley in particular, I'm going to get him back. I promise you. They went to see Ranger at 10 the next morning. Margaret walked in on her cane with Caleb at her elbow and the woman at the desk. Her name was Rita, and she was the woman who had told Caleb the dog was laying against the bars. She looked up and looked at Margaret and stood up out of her chair. Come with me, Mom, she said. He's back here. She took them past a row of runs full of barking, jumping shepherds and mutts and one enormous mastiff, and at the very end there was a run with a big shepherd laying in the front corner, his nose against the bars, exactly the way Rita had described. Ranger saw Margaret through the mesh and did not stand up. He did not bark. He put his head flat on the concrete floor and made a small sound in his throat, and his tail moved once, twice, 3 times, and stopped. Margaret let herself down on the concrete floor beside the run, with her cane laid across her lap, and she put her hand through the bars, and Ranger put his nose in the palm of her hand. There you are, she said. There you are, big boy, there you are. Caleb sat on the floor beside her. Rita brought them a cushion for Margaret to sit on that she did not offer to anybody else, and Rita went back to the front and closed the door to the run area so they could have privacy. They sat with him for an hour and 40 minutes. Ranger did not move his nose from Margaret's palm the whole time. Margaret talked to him about the orchard and about the biscuits Ethel had brought and about the way the light had come across the kitchen table that morning. She talked to him about her son. She talked to him about the letter. She told him about the trust and about Ben Cardoza and about how the farm was safe and how he was going to come home in a few days and how she was going to be waiting on the porch with a bowl of the good kibble Caleb had bought at the vet. Ranger's tail thumped once when she said that. Caleb sat with his back against the cinder block wall and did not say a word for the whole hour and 40 minutes. He watched Margaret's hand. He watched Ranger's ribs move up and down. He thought very carefully about what he was going to do. When their time was up, Margaret got herself back to her feet with Caleb's help. She stood at the front of the run and put her palm flat against the bars. Ranger stood up finally on all 4 feet and put the top of his head against her palm through the bars. You come home, she said. She turned. She walked. She did not look back, because she did not trust herself to. At the front desk, Rita leaned across and said quietly, Somebody's coming this afternoon, from the county attorney's office. He's asked to see the dog. That's not normal for a bite hold. That's more than normal. I don't know what it means. I thought you should know. Do you know who it is? An assistant county attorney. His name is on the list, but I... She glanced at the phone. He's Grant Whitaker's brother-in-law. Caleb met her eyes. Thank you, Rita. There's a woman named Sarah Whitaker who has been calling here twice a day since he came in, Rita said, quiet and quick. She wants to know when the recommendation for a removal order will be filed. Those are her exact words. I have logged every call. He walked out to the truck. Margaret was already there, both hands on the door handle to steady herself, her face very pale. You heard? He said. I heard. He drove them to Ben Cardoza's office. Ben Cardoza was in a meeting when they walked in, but he came out of his conference room when he saw them in the waiting area, and one look at Margaret's face was enough for him to close the door on his other clients and take her by both hands. He's trying to have the dog taken away for good, Caleb said. His brother-in-law is the assistant county attorney. His wife is calling twice a day asking when they'll file for it. Ben Cardoza's face did a thing Caleb had never seen it do before. It went perfectly still. It was the stillness of a man calculating exactly how many seconds it would take him to end a specific thing, and it was not a lawyerly stillness. It was a marine stillness. Miss Cassidy, he called over his shoulder, I need you to get me the presiding judge of the 11th Circuit on the telephone. And I need you to get me the State Bar Association's ethics line, and I need you to get me the county sheriff in that order, and I need you to hold my 3 o'clock. Thank you. He put his hand on Margaret's shoulder. Mrs. Finley, he said, would you be all right sitting in my conference room for the next hour or so? Yes. There is coffee, and there is a couch, and there is a blanket. Cassidy will bring you a book to read if you want one. Mr. Morse and I are going to make a number of telephone calls. Yes, sir. They made the telephone calls. Ben Cardoza spent 40 minutes on the phone with the presiding judge of the 11th Circuit and 35 minutes on the phone with a woman at the State Bar Association and 45 minutes on the phone with the county sheriff. Caleb sat in the chair across from him and watched him work. Ben Cardoza was, in a courtroom, a stooped, quiet, careful man. Ben Cardoza on the telephone was a different animal. He was crisp, he was patient, he was extremely specific. He used names, he used dates. He used the word conflict 17 times, Caleb counted. At 2 in the afternoon, Ben Cardoza hung up the last call and folded his hands on his desk. The presiding judge has vacated the guardianship petition on his own motion, he said. It won't be on Thursday's docket because there won't be a docket. Grant Whitaker's motion has been dismissed with prejudice. The Bar Association will be opening a review of Eleanor Peck within the week. The sheriff has spoken to Rita at Animal Control. There will be no visit from the assistant county attorney. The dog will complete his hold uninterrupted. And I have filed a motion for release on the ground that the alleged victim does not exist. Judge Halloran has said he will sign that motion the moment it hits his desk in the morning. Caleb looked at him a long moment. That's it? That's it. There is nothing dramatic about winning like this. You call the right people, and you have the right paper in front of you, and you do it before your opponent knows what you're doing. He stood up. He held out his hand. Caleb stood up. Caleb took it. Sergeant Morse, Ben Cardoza said, you did good. On the 5th morning of the 10-day hold, Caleb drove to the shelter alone because he had asked Margaret to stay home and rest, and because he wanted to be the one to bring Ranger back to her. Rita opened Ranger's run herself. She had a little brown bag with her that she pressed into Caleb's hand. Beef strip, she said. It's from my lunch. Don't tell him. He walked Ranger out of the shelter on a leash he did not need to hold tight. Ranger walked at his knee, and when they got to the truck, Ranger put his front paws on the driver's seat and pushed himself up in one long, clean movement and sat down in the passenger seat and looked at Caleb with the same steady brown eyes. Let's go home, Caleb said. He drove. He was halfway down the county highway when the phone rang. It was Ethel. Her voice was flat and fast, the way people talk when they have already been afraid for 2 minutes. "Grant's car is in the driveway," she said. "He's on the porch, he's yelling. He has a woman with him. I think that's Sarah. Margaret told him to leave and he's not leaving. Caleb, get here." He hit the accelerator. He got there in 11 minutes. He got there without breaking any laws that mattered, and he did not remember the drive at all. He pulled up to the gravel drive, and there was Grant's silver sedan parked crooked across the middle of the drive, blocking it. And there was Grant on the porch, with his back to the road and his arm out, one finger pointed straight at Margaret's face. And there was a small blonde woman standing beside him who could only be Sarah. And Ethel was between Grant and Margaret, with her arms crossed, 5 feet 3 inches of purple cardigan, and Grant was still yelling. Ranger was out of the truck the second Caleb opened the door. The dog did not bark. The dog crossed the yard the way he had crossed it the first morning at the trail, silent, direct, on purpose. He came up the porch steps and he sat down in front of Margaret. He was between Margaret and Grant. He was not growling. He was simply there. He was very, very large in that moment. He was the size of a whole other person on the porch. Grant stopped in the middle of a word. Caleb walked up the porch steps behind Ranger. "You need to get in your car, Mr. Whitaker," he said. His voice was quiet. It was the voice he had used with the paramedics on the phone at the trail. Flat, clean. "You don't tell me what to do, Morse." "I'm not telling you. I'm suggesting. You know what my aunt has done to me?" Grant's face was red at the top of the cheekbones and white around the mouth. "She has stolen my inheritance. She has stolen my project. She has stolen—" He looked at his wife. His wife looked at her feet. "She has taken everything I have worked for out of my hands, and she is standing here on this porch with a Marine and a purple sweater and a dog like she is." "Army," Caleb said. Grant blinked. "What? I was Army, not Marine, it matters. And she has not stolen anything, Mr. Whitaker. What she has is what her son gave her. She had it the entire time. You were the one trying to take it." "That trust is not enforceable." "The trust is entirely enforceable. Ben Cardoza wrote it. Judge Halloran has read it. The Bar Association is reading Ms. Peck's file. The presiding judge has vacated your petition. Your brother-in-law will not be visiting the county animal shelter tomorrow. And the dog you had impounded is on this porch, and he is not going anywhere." Grant took one step forward. Ranger did not move. Ranger did not need to. Ranger simply exhaled once, and the whole porch felt smaller. Grant took the step back. Sarah Whitaker, who had said nothing this whole time, put her hand on her husband's arm. "Grant," she said. Her voice was very tired. "Grant, it's done. It's been done since before we started. Let's go." Grant looked at her. He looked at Margaret. Margaret was standing behind Ethel with one hand on the doorframe. Her face was very calm and very sad. She was not angry. She looked at him the way you look at a nephew you have watched grow up crooked and cannot fix. "Grant, honey," she said softly, "your mother would be so sorry." That was the thing that broke him, not the trust, not the lawyer, not the dog. That one sentence. Grant Whitaker's whole face changed at once from red to grey, and he took a long, shaky breath, and he turned and walked down the porch steps and past Ranger and past Caleb and past his wife and got into his crooked sedan and sat down and put both hands on the steering wheel and did not move for a full 30 seconds. Sarah got in the passenger side. She did not look up. She did not say anything to any of them. The sedan backed out of the drive slowly, and then it was gone. Ethel let out a breath she had been holding for what looked like the better part of a year. Margaret sat down on the porch step. She put her hand on Ranger's neck. "He's home," she said. "He's home." She put her forehead against Ranger's forehead, and Ranger closed his eyes. They sat on the porch for a long time. Ethel went inside and made coffee. She brought it out to them in 3 mugs, and they drank it slowly, watching the light change across the orchard. Ranger lay across Margaret's feet and did not move. "I have to tell you something," Margaret said eventually. "Yes, Ma'am. I don't want you to go back to that apartment." Caleb did not answer. "I've been thinking about it," she said. "I've been thinking about it since the first morning, and now that Grant is not going to be around, I need you to know that this house is more house than I need, and Daniel's room is Daniel's room, and I would like it very much if you would sleep in it, not because I'm afraid to be alone, because I would like you to have a home, because Ranger picked you, and Ranger has never been wrong about a person in his life, and because I would like to see somebody Daniel's age sitting at that kitchen table in the mornings." He looked at her. "Miss Finley." "Margaret. Margaret, I don't know what to say. Say yes, or say you'll think about it. Either one is fine. But say something before I start crying, please, because I am 76 and I would like to make it through the afternoon." He laughed. It was a short, low, surprised laugh. He hadn't laughed in a long time. "I'll think about it," he said. Then he thought about it, for the length of one long breath. "And I think the answer is yes." Ethel put her hand over her mouth from the porch rail and looked away, out at the orchard, so nobody would see her face. Ranger's tail thumped once against the porch boards. The trust held. Ben Cardoza filed one last set of papers the following Monday and closed the file and sent Margaret the bill for $1 and no cents, which he refused to increase when she offered to pay him properly. Whitaker and Vance Development lost the tract they had been trying to assemble around the Finley property because their financing had been contingent on that tract, and their bank quietly stepped away from the loan. The Bar Association concluded that Eleanor Peck had committed multiple ethics violations in connection with her representation of Grant Whitaker and multiple other elderly clients over a period of years, and her license to practice law was suspended. Cassidy, the great-niece with the big mouth, was hired the same week by Ben Cardoza to be his second paralegal, and she brought him coffee every morning for the rest of his career. Grant Whitaker's company went bankrupt within a year. Sarah Whitaker left him within 18 months. He moved to a small city up north where nobody knew his name and started over, or so people said. Margaret sent him a Christmas card every December. He never wrote back. She kept sending them anyway. That was who she was. Caleb moved into Daniel's room the second week of the following month. He kept his apartment for 2 more months out of caution, and then he gave it up. He brought over his coffee pot. He brought over his rifle case, which he set in the back of the closet in his own new room and did not open. He brought over 3 photos in cardboard frames and set them on the dresser. He brought over his boots. That was almost everything he owned. He got a job in Millbrook working for a man named Harold, who ran a small equipment repair shop off the highway. Harold had been in Vietnam. He did not ask Caleb any questions about his own service. He just showed him how to rebuild a starter motor and told him he could listen to the radio in the shop as long as it wasn't country, and paid him fair. Caleb worked there 6 days a week. He came home to the farmhouse for lunch every day because it was only 20 minutes away, and because Margaret waited on the porch for him with a sandwich, and because Ranger waited beside her. Ranger got old over the years. He got white in the muzzle. He slept longer. He climbed the porch steps a little more carefully, but he still walked out to the truck to meet Caleb every night, and he still lay across Margaret's feet, and he still knew. Ethel came for dinner every Sunday. She brought biscuits. She brought news. She lived to be 93, and she was still telling Caleb her opinion about the local school board the week before she died. At her funeral, Margaret and Caleb sat in the front pew, and Ranger lay across both their feet, because the pastor was a reasonable man who understood the situation. Caleb slept without dreams most nights. He slept with dreams some nights. He did not count the ceiling tiles anymore. When something bad came up in his head, he got up quiet and walked out to the porch and sat on the step. And after a while, Ranger would come out and sit beside him and press against his shin. And eventually, he would go back inside and lie down and sleep again. That was how it worked. It worked pretty well. He went back to Cedar Creek Trail one morning in late September, 3 years after the morning it had all begun. He hadn't been back, not once. He had driven past the entrance on his way to Franklin more than 100 times, and he had always kept driving. There had been no reason to stop. He had a porch now. He had a kitchen table. He had Margaret in her chair by the window and Ranger at her feet, and he had all the mornings he needed. But that September, Margaret had had a small stroke, a very small one, the doctor said, not the kind that took anything away. She was tired. She wanted to sleep more. She wanted Caleb to make her coffee instead of making it herself, and Caleb was glad to make her coffee, and they sat on the porch every morning now while the sun came up. But she was, she said, a little bit closer to the edge of the field than she had been, and she had asked Caleb to do her a favor. "I want you to go to Cedar Creek," she said. "I want you to sit on the bench where you were sitting that morning, just for a minute. I want to know what it looks like now." "Why?" "Because I want to say thank you to that place. On my behalf, that's all." So he drove out to Cedar Creek Trail on a September morning with a styrofoam cup of gas station coffee in the cup holder and Ranger in the passenger seat, and the light coming through the leaves the way it had come through the leaves that first morning. He walked to the bench. The bench was still there. The paint had gone soft. Somebody had scratched initials into the seat since he'd been there last. He sat down on it. He set the coffee cup on the wooden slats beside him. Ranger sat down on his boot, the way Ranger had always sat down on his boot. He looked out at the water. He looked at the mist coming off the top of it. He looked at the light on the far side of the creek. He listened to the wind in the oaks, and the wind was the same wind, and the water was the same water, and the bench was the same bench, and none of it was the same at all. He thought about the man who had sat on that bench 3 years earlier, the man who had counted ceiling tiles at 4 in the morning, the man who had made a routine out of 45 minutes on a bench because he could not think of any other reason to leave his apartment, the man who had drunk cold coffee and stared at nothing and gone home and stared at more nothing and slept the way an exhausted body sleeps and woken up and started over. He thought about that man very kindly, like a man he had known and lost track of. Ranger's chin was heavy on his knee. He put his hand on top of the shepherd's head. "You did that," he said quietly. "You picked me up off this bench. You know that, right? You picked me up off this bench and you walked me down that trail and you gave me a person. You gave me a whole life. That was you." The dog's tail moved once against the ground. That was all. He sat there a little while longer, long enough for the mist to lift. Then he stood up. He picked up the empty coffee cup. He walked back down the path with Ranger at his knee, the two of them moving through the same wet leaves and the same slanted light, and he drove home. He drove home. Margaret was on the porch when he pulled in. She was in her chair. She had a blanket on her lap and a cup of coffee cooling on the little table beside her. She had asked Caleb to leave the good chair on the porch so she could sit in it whenever she wanted. And he had, and she did. She saw the truck. She lifted one hand in a small wave. Caleb parked, and Ranger jumped down and crossed the yard and went up the porch steps and put his chin on Margaret's knee. Margaret put her hand into the fur behind his ears without looking, because she never had to look. She looked at Caleb instead. Was it still there? She asked. It was still there. Was it pretty? It was pretty. Was there anybody else? No, it was just us. She smiled. She closed her eyes. The sun was warm on the porch, and the fall light was slanting through the orchard behind them, and the apples that were left on the trees were red and gold, and the wind moved once through the branches and made a sound like a person shifting in bed. Caleb sat down on the porch beside her chair and put his back against the porch rail. Ranger lay across both their feet, Margaret's slipper and Caleb's boot, and closed his eyes. Margaret's hand found Caleb's shoulder. "You know what I've been thinking about?" she said. "Tell me." "That first morning, when you came down through the brambles, I remember. I remember thinking, before I passed out, I remember thinking, that man is going to save my life. That's what I thought. That's the exact thought I had." He looked at her. "Margaret," he said, "you saved mine. That's the way it worked." She squeezed his shoulder. "I know," she said, "but you don't have to tell an old woman that. She knows. She has known that since the first morning you sat down at her hospital bed and didn't know what to do with your hands." She closed her eyes again. She was tired. It had been a long few weeks. She smiled, a small smile that was mostly for the light in the orchard, and mostly for the dog on her feet, and mostly for the young man on the porch beside her. "Go on and finish your coffee, sweetheart," she said. He did. He finished his coffee on the porch in the September sun. Ranger's ribs went up and down under his palm. Margaret's breathing was slow, and even beside him. The wind moved through the orchard. The apples hung on the branches. The kitchen door was open. The whole house was open. He sat there a long time. And that is the story of the German shepherd who touched a soldier's knee at Cedar Creek Trail and asked for help, and the soldier who followed the dog, and the old woman in the gully, and the son who had done the last work of his life to give his mother a home, and the porch where 3 lives that should have been alone found each other and stayed there. Every one of them. If you were with me all the way to the end, thank you for sitting in the porch light with us. If it moved something in you, leave a little something in the comments. A word about your own porch, your own bench, the dog, or the person who once picked you up on a hard morning. Give this a like if you'd like more stories like this one, and subscribe and stay with me because there are more stories waiting on this same porch. Take care of yourselves out there. Take care of each other. Good night.